This is 1.3, Solving Absolute Value Equations, Part 2. In this part, we're going to have absolute value equations where there are terms outside of the absolute value, outside of the bars. So in this first example, we have the x plus 8 inside the absolute value, but then we have a minus 5 outside the absolute value. So when we're solving, we want to move terms outside the bars first. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides and get x plus 8 equals 7. Then I check to make sure that's not a negative number, so it's a positive 7, so we're okay. And now I do what we did in the last section. I set up two equations. So I'm going to set up x plus 8 equals 7 and negative parenthesis x plus 8 equals 7. Solving the one on the left, I'm going to subtract 8 and get x equals negative 1. The one on the right, I'm going to distribute the negative sign and get negative x minus 8 equals 7. I'll add the 8. So I have negative x equals 15. And I have to be careful. There's still a negative in front of that x, and that's really a negative 1. So I'm going to divide by negative 1. And I'll write my answer over here. We get x equals negative 15. Next example. This time we have more than one thing outside the absolute value. We have the 3 in front. I'll go ahead and highlight it. And then we also have the plus 8. When you have multiple things outside of the absolute value, you want to move addition and subtraction first, then multiplication and division. So I'm going to subtract 8 first to both sides. So that gives me 3 times the absolute value of negative 8x equals 72. I'm going to divide by 3. And so I'm going to get absolute value of negative 8x equals, if you're not sure what 72 divided by 3 is, you could use a calculator or you could use some long division. I'll do it over here. So I'm going to do 3 divided into 72. 3 goes into 7 twice to get me 6. 7 minus 6 is 1. Bring down the 2. 3 goes into 12 4 times, and so I get 24. Then I'm going to set up my two equations. So I'm going to say negative 8x equals 24. And I'm going to say negative 8x, don't drop a negative there, equals 24. So then I'm going to divide by a negative 8 for the equation on the left. And 24 divided by negative 8 is negative 3. For the one on the right, I'm going to, in a way, distribute that minus sign, but there's only one term. Notice there's no plus or minus inside like there have been for the last few examples. So this minus only gets distributed to the one term, which is going to get me positive 8x equals 24. Dividing by 8, I get x equals 3. Next example. For the next one, this one is a little tricky to see because there's 5 minus 8 in front. But this 8 is right up against the absolute value, which means it's not 5 minus 8. It's 5 minus 8 times the absolute value. So the 8 gets multiplied by the absolute value first. So that means when I'm deciding what to move, and I have to decide addition or subtraction, multiplication or division, that 8 is being multiplied. The 5 is 5 minus. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract the 5. So that's going to give me negative 8, absolute value of negative 2n equals negative 80. Then I can divide by the negative 8 because that's being multiplied. So I get absolute value of negative 2n equals 10. We're okay, that's a positive value, so I can keep going. So I'm going to set up negative 2n equals 10 and negative 2n equals 10. For the first equation, I'll divide by a negative 2 and get n equals negative 5. For the second one, I only have that one term in there. There's no plus and no minus. So I'm going to go ahead and do minus a negative. That's going to give me a positive 2n equals 10. Divide by 2 and get n equals 5. Next example. This one, I have absolute value, but outside of the absolute value, I have an 8 in the bottom. An 8 in the bottom is division. So I'm going to rewrite this one just so that I can see what's going on. It's a little close to the directions. So I'm going to say 7p plus 4 divided by 8 equals 3. Be careful when you're writing these absolute values that they don't end up looking like ones. So now the 8 is outside, but the 8 is being divided. So to move that, I'm going to multiply both sides by 8. So that's going to give me absolute value of 7p plus 4 equals 24. Now the absolute value is by itself, so I can set up my two equations. I can say 7p plus 4 equals 24, and 7p plus 4 in parentheses with a negative, make that negative a little bigger, equals 24. For the equation on the left, I'll subtract 4, and I get 7p equals 20. I'll divide by 7. 20 doesn't divide nicely by 7, so I'm just going to leave it as 20 over 7. Let me make that a 7. For the second equation, I'm going to distribute the negative sign. So I'm going to have negative 7p minus 4 equals 24. Then I'm going to add 4 and get negative 7p equals 28. Divide by negative 7. And I get p equals 28 divided by negative 7 is negative 4. Next page. The next one is very similar to the one 2 examples before. So I've got this negative here. That's really a negative 1. Whoops, that made it look like a plus sign. So that's really a negative 1. And that's getting multiplied by the absolute value. So I'm not going to move that first. I'm going to move the 3 first by subtracting. And so I'm going to get negative absolute value of 8x minus 6 equal to 0. Remember that this negative is really a negative 1, so I'm going to divide by a negative 1 and get absolute value of 8x minus 6 equals 0. And then I'll set up my two equations. So I'll say 8x minus 6 equals 0 and negative parenthesis 8x minus 6 equals 0. Solving the equation on the left, I'll do plus 6 to both sides and get 8x equals 6. I'll divide by 8. 6 does not divide by 8 nicely, but it does reduce because both are divisible by 2. So I can reduce this to 3 over 4. Equation on the right, I'm going to distribute that negative sign. And I'm going to do negative 8x plus 6 equals 0. I'll subtract 6 from both sides, and I'll get negative 8x equals negative 6. Divide by negative 8. And I've got a negative divided by a negative, which is positive, and 6 over 8 is one that we just did. That reduces to 3 over 4. If you notice, these are the same. And the reason they're the same is because it was 0. Okay? So what we found here is that when you have absolute value equal to 0, you don't have two answers. You have one solution. Okay, I'll put a little squiggle in there so those don't look like ones. So when the absolute value is equal to 0, you have one solution. Next example. We've got a little bit of everything in this one. So I've got a 6 in front. I've got a minus 9 in the back. I have to decide which one moves first. The minus moves first. Remember, addition and subtraction move first. So I'm going to say plus 9 and plus 9. I've got 6, absolute value of 1 minus 5x. 57 plus 9 is 66. There we go. I'm going to then divide by the 6 because that's still outside the absolute value. So I get absolute value of 1 minus 5x equals 11. I'll set up my two equations. So 1 minus 5x equals 11, and negative parenthesis 1 minus 5x equals 11. To solve this, I'll subtract the 1. So I'll get negative 5x equals 10. Divide by a negative 5. And get x equals negative 2. Next one I'll distribute because I do have a minus sign in the middle there. So I'll get negative 1 plus 5x equals 11. I'll add 1 and get 5x equals 12. Divide by 5. 12 doesn't divide by 5 nicely, and it doesn't reduce. So I'm going to leave it as 12 over 5. Last example. Again, a little bit of everything. So this one, I've got a 2 and a minus 5 out front. I have to decide which one to move first. Well, that 5 is up against the absolute value, so it's multiplying the absolute value. The 2 is not multiplying. The 2 is 2 minus, okay? So I'm going to subtract the 2 first. And I'm going to get negative 5, absolute value of 5m minus 5 equal to negative 75. Negative 5, I'm going to divide. And I know that it divides evenly because 75 ends in a 5, but if you're not sure, let's do 5 divided by 75. So 5 goes into 7 once to get me 5. Subtracting gets me a 2. Bring down the 5. 5 into 25 goes 5 times. So I'm going to have absolute value of 5m minus 5 equals 15. And I'll set up my two equations. So I'll say 5m minus 5 equals 15. And I'll say minus 5m minus 5 equals 15. The left-hand equation, I'll add 5 first and get 5m equals 20. Dividing by 5, 20 divided by 5 equals 4. For the right-hand equation, I'm going to distribute my negative. So I'll get negative 5m plus 5 equals 15. I'll subtract 5 from both sides and get negative 5m equals 10. I'll divide both sides by negative 5 and get m equals negative 2.